David Martin, our Pentagon correspondent, is at the Defense Department at the moment with details about the recovery operation. David?
Dan, the recovery operation is being run by the Coast Guard, which had two cutters in the area at the time. There were no U.S. Navy ships in the immediate area. You have the two Coast Guard cutters, a third cutter that is close to the area, all three of them converging on the site of where this debris has rained down. There is a report, and we cannot confirm it from here yet, that the actual recovery operation was delayed somewhat to stay out of the area while all this debris rained down. There are two Navy ships en route to the area. One's about 45 minutes away. The other is about 2 hours away. They, I don't think, will be any use in the immediate search for any possible survivors, but I think there will be a wide search of the area trying to recover all possible debris in an attempt to figure out what happened here.
David, it's worth emphasizing that this is the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, a civilian agency that is responsible for the space shuttle launches, as they have been for all of them, and as they have been for the entire United States space program. The decision was made in the late 1950s and implemented all through the 1960s to make America's space program a civilian space program. And while we indeed have some military uses for our space program, our way, the American style, has been to make it a civilian space agency as opposed to the military space agency of the Soviet Union.
That's right, although the Air Force was going to become one of the prime users of the space shuttle because they were going to use it originally as the sole means for putting all U.S. military satellites into space. But because of so many difficulties that had occurred on earlier flights, the Air Force had insisted on retaining the capability to launch some high-priority satellites with its own rockets. Now, of course, that we have lost, apparently, one entire shuttle, which, if you think about it for a moment, is the equivalent of the Air Force in one brief moment losing a quarter of all its airplanes. It's a major catastrophe, just not only in terms of the lives involved here, but in terms of the equipment. And now that that is lost, it is going to throw this program of cooperation between the military and the civilian NASA agency into great disarray, I would think.
Thank you, David Martin at the Pentagon. Space Shuttle Challenger exploded in air in a huge fireball this morning just after 11:30 a.m. Eastern Time. 1 minute and 12 seconds into launch. No word on the fate of the 7 humans aboard the space shuttle. That would have been the crew plus the school teacher, Krista McAuliffe of Concord, New Hampshire. No word on any survivors. As you saw from the recovery area, only small portions of debris could even be seen in the sea east of Florida. We want now to review who was aboard that space shuttle, who these explorers, the space voyagers, were. Francis Dick Scobie, Air Force Major 46, born in Washington State, was the commander. Michael Smith, who was the pilot, age 40, U.S. Navy, born in Morehead City, North Carolina. Judy Resnick, astronaut, 36 years old, Ph.D., born in Akron, Ohio. All of these members of the crew. Ronald McNair, another Ph.D., 35 years old, born in Lake City, South Carolina. Ellison Onizuka, Major, U.S. Air Force, 39 years old, born in Hawaii. And 41-year-old Gregory Jorvis, born in Detroit, crew member. And then the special passenger aboard this Space Shuttle Challenger, Krista McAuliffe, 37 years old, school teacher, mother out of Concord, New Hampshire. Those were the Americans aboard this morning's Space Shuttle Challenger launch. As you may have heard us report earlier, the school children from the school of school teacher Krista McAuliffe were called together at the school this morning to watch the launch. They watched and applauded as the launch got off, noting that Bruce Hall said later that close observers of the launch thought that the Space Shuttle Challenger was getting up a little slower this morning than was usual for such launches. Of course, those school children had no way of knowing that, and they applauded as the Space Shuttle Challenger seemed to get off all right, and then they watched in horror as in doing the live shot of the takeoff as that big fireball appeared, and it was clear that something went wrong. Correspondent Eric Ingberg reports now that an inquiry panel is to be established to investigate the cause of today's accident, as per standard NASA procedures. The makeup of the panel, when it will start its work, still being evaluated. Of course, as the National Aeronautics and Space Administration tries to figure out not only what happened this morning, you can see in the videotape, both the real-time videotape and the slow-motion videotape, some of what happened, but of course what NASA wants to know is why it happened. This is the first time there's been such a disaster during a space flight. In 1967, 3 astronauts in the Apollo program, the program that eventually put the United States on the moon. During that program, 3 astronauts died in an accident on the launch pad. This is the first disaster in space for the United States. 7 persons aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger this morning. Their fates cannot be absolutely determined at this hour. Again, we are told that President Reagan watched in, quote, stunned silence as the shuttle exploded this morning. We're told that the president was watching the liftoff live from Florida. President Reagan's spokesman, Larry Speaks, is saying that the president will go ahead with his State of the Union address tonight. Said Speaks, and I quote him, "I'm certain the president will feel compelled to mention this tragedy depending on the outcome." That's unquote Larry Speaks. Now, President Reagan's State of the Union address will be carried live this evening on CBS. That will be at 9 o'clock tonight Eastern Time, 8 o'clock, of course, Central Time, and 6 o'clock in the West. Now, we want to emphasize that there's much unknown about what happened this morning and why it happened. Here now is an animated sequence. This is animation showing how the launch should have gone. At 2 minutes into the flight, the shuttle's 2 boosters, the solid rocket boosters, should separate from the spacecraft itself. That would be 2 minutes in. The spacecraft never got to that point. The boosters would plunge into the ocean after they'd done their job of helping get the spaceship headed toward orbit, and they'd be retrieved for further use, those solid rocket boosters. And now that's how today's launch of Space Shuttle Challenger should have gone. Instead, this is what happens, or appears to have happened. At less than 2 minutes into the flight, at about 1 minute and 12 seconds, there was an explosion. After what seemed to be an ordinary launch, the explosion seems to be on the right side of one of those solid launch boosters, solid rocket fuel boosters. Pieces of the 100-ton spacecraft began to come down into the water about 28 miles downrange from the launch site. The first explosion seemed to be in one of the solid rocket fuel boosters. The next explosion consumed the liquid fuel on which the space shuttle rides and consumed the whole space shuttle, the solid rocket boosters, the liquid fuel tank, and the space shuttle itself. Bruce Hall at Cape Canaveral now has more on what may have happened to the engines. Bruce?
Dan, we have been operating on the theory, although we have heard absolutely nothing from NASA about this, but the first people who were reviewing the tape, just as you have been saying, it appeared there was a possible small explosion or some type of ignition in the solid rocket booster, and then there was a major explosion in the main tank. Now people have had the opportunity to review these tapes, to look at the slow motion as we have been doing. A second theory, and I must emphasize, Dan, this is only a theory. A second theory is coming to the forefront now, and that is that an explosion took place first in the main engine tank, and it occurred right at the seam, at the point where the orbiter, the Space Shuttle Challenger, is attached to the main fuel tank. I now have a small model here with me, nothing like the larger one that you have, but if you can see right in at the very point on this tank, if you can hold it, it's about to fall on this, but there is a place where the Shuttle Challenger is attached to the main tank. It is the theory here, among others, that it very well could have been a seam on the main tank. These are not reusable tanks like the solid rocket boosters. These are used once and are ejected over the Indian Ocean and go into the ocean. But the theory is a possibility that there was a rupture right along the seam next to the point where the Space Shuttle Challenger is attached to the main tank. The orbiter is attached at that point, and this was a point during maximum thrust, if you will recall. This is the point in the mission where you have absolute full thrust. And the last words that we heard from the Space Shuttle said, Roger, go to throttle up. That's go to throttle up. That is to go to maximum thrust. And within a second or two after that point, it is when it appears the explosion took place. Now, I must emphasize again, Dan, these are only theories. We have not heard anything from NASA. These are the theories of people who are looking at the tapes here, and they are also looking in slow motion trying to make some determination. I'm sure that we will have further definitive word from NASA later on.